Hello, today's daily reading comes from the book of the Apocrypha. We're reading from the book of Jasher, chapter 76, verses 32 through 62, and it reads as follows. And the number of the children which Pharaoh slew was 375. But the Lord hearkened not to the physicians of the king of Egypt, and the plague went on increasing mightily. And Pharaoh was 10 years afflicted with that plague. Still the heart of Pharaoh was more hardened against the children of Israel. And at the end of the 10 years, the Lord continued to afflict Pharaoh with destructive plagues. And the Lord smote him with a bad tumor and sickness at the stomach, and that plague turned to a severe boil. At that time, two ministers of Pharaoh came from the land of Goshen, where all the children of Israel were, and went to the house of Pharaoh and said to him, We have seen the children of Israel slacken in their work and negligent in their labor. And when Pharaoh heard the words of his ministers, his anger was kindled against the children of Israel exceedingly. For he was greatly grieved at his bodily pain. And he answered and said, Now that the children of Israel know that I am ill, they turn and scoff at us. Now therefore harness my chariot for me, and I will go myself to Goshen, and will see the scoff of the children of Israel with which they are deriding me. So his servants harnessed the chariot for him, and they took and made him ride upon a horse, for he was not able to ride for himself. And he took with him 10 horsemen and 10 footmen, and went to the children of Israel to Goshen. And when they had come to the border of Egypt, the king's horse passed into the narrow place, elevated in the hollow part of the vineyard, fenced on both sides, the low plain country being on the other side. And the horses ran rapidly in that place, and pressed each other, and the other horses pressed the king's horse. The king's horse fell into the low plain while the king was riding upon it. And when he fell, the chariot turned over the king's face, and the horse lay upon the king, and the king cried out, for his flesh was very sore. And the flesh of the king was torn from him, and his bones were broken, and he could not ride, for this thing was from the Lord to him. For the Lord had heard the cries of his people, the children of Israel, in their affliction. And his servants carried him upon their shoulders a little at a time, and they brought him back to Egypt. And the horsemen who were with him came also back to Egypt, and they placed him in his bed. And the king knew that his end was come to die. So Apeneth, the queen, his wife, came and cried before the king, and the king wept a great weeping with her. And all his nobles and servants came on that day and saw the king in that affliction, and wept a great weeping with him. And the princes of the king and all the counselors advised the king to cause one to reign in his stead in the land, whomsoever he should choose from his sons. And the king had 3 sons and 2 daughters, which Aperaneth, the queen of his wife, had borne to him, besides the king's children of concubines. And these were the names of the firstborn, Othri, the second, Adikam, and the third, Morion, and their sisters, the name of the elder, Bethea, and the other, Akuzi. And Othri, the firstborn of the king, was an idiot, precipitate and hurried in his words. But Adikam was a cunning and wise man, and knowing in all the wisdom of Egypt, but of unseemly aspect, thick in flesh, and very short in stature. His height was 1 cubit. And when the king saw Adikam, his son, intelligent and wise in all things, the king resolved that he should be king in his stead after his death. And he took for him a wife, Gedudah, daughter of Abalat. And he was 10 years old, and she bore him 4 sons. And he afterward went and took 3 wives, and begat 8 sons and 3 daughters. And the disorder greatly prevailed over the king, and his flesh stank like the flesh of a carcass cast upon the field in summertime, during the heat of the sun. And when the king saw that his sickness was greatly strengthened itself over him, he ordered his son Adikam to be brought to him, and they made him king over the land in his place. And at the end of 3 years the king died in shame, disgrace, and disgust, and his servants carried him and buried him in the sepulchre of the kings of Egypt and Zoan Mizraim. But they embalmed him not as was usual with kings, for his flesh was putrid, and they could not approach to embalm him on account of the stench, so they buried him in haste. For this evil was from the Lord to him, for the Lord had paid him back evil for evil, which in his days he had done to Israel. So he died with terror and with shame, and his son Adikam reigned in his place. Amen.